Hello everyone and welcome to the rematch between International Master Levi Rossman, also known as Gothamchess, and Grandmaster Nicholas Theodoru. So this game was played in the New York Taco Bell Invitational. Levi was playing with the white pieces. He had a bit of a rough start. He was on 1 out of 5. Nicholas also did not have the start that he wanted. He was on 50%. Anyway, Levi started the game off with the move 1d4. And Nicholas played knight f6. And Nicholas is known to be a King's Indian player, so someone like c4, g6 would have probably happened, and then knight c3, bishop g7, etc, etc. But instead of that, Gotham, or Levi, wanted to throw him off on move 2 with the move knight to c3. So with the move knight c3, white is preparing e4. So that's why Nicholas plays d5, and now Levi goes bishop to f4. And this is called the Jobava London. Usually in the London you put your bishop on f4, but you don't put your knight on c3. That's why it's given this specific name. I think the main move here is c5 or e6. Either way, black has a lot of options here of getting a good position, but instead of all that, Nicholas played the move g6. Alright, so Levi continued with the move e3, bishop g7, and now h4. This move has been recommended in some courses. The idea is very simple. White just wants to break open on the king side with the move h5. And if, let's say, black castles, white is just going to go h5. In the case of knight takes, boom, sacrifice the exchange. And white gets a huge attack. He's hitting this pawn, and this king will feel a lot of heat here on the king side. So instead of all that, Nicholas plays the move h5, stopping the pawn advance. So Levi goes queen to d2, castles, and knight to f3. So his idea is to put a knight on e5 and just take it from there. So Nicholas goes c5, putting pressure in the center. Levi goes knight to c6 and knight e5 and knight c6 by Nicholas. Alright, so Levi goes bishop to b5, putting pressure on the knight on c6. And here someone like pawn takes d4, pawn takes, and trading on e4, maybe knight e4 would have been a better move for Nicholas, but instead of that, he took on e5 right away. And after pawn takes, it's not that easy because this knight is under attack, and if the knight moves, you're going to lose your pawn on d5. So Nicholas went knight to g4, knight takes d5 by Levi. And here I was a little bit surprised as I was watching the game that Nicholas did not take on e5 right away. It feels like the position should be very comfortable for black, but instead of all that, he played the move e6. And my assumption is that maybe he missed the sequence that Levi went for here. Levi played knight f6 check. This knight has to be taken. Now queen takes d8, intermezzo, rook takes d8. And here Nicholas probably expected Levi to take. And after bishop takes, black has a pretty comfortable position. This pawn is under attack. You would have to play someone like c3. And here black has some options. He could play, let's say, a6, the bishop drops back. And maybe someone like b5 and b4 to put pressure on white's queen side. But instead of that, Levi found a very strong move. And once again, I think this was probably missed by Nicholas. The move bishop g5, an intermezzo. Now your knight is still under attack and it's pinned. And you cannot move the knight. Because if you move the knight, then you're going to lose your rook on d8. You're down exchange. You're just going to lose the game. So Nicholas played bishop to d7. And this looks clever. Right, let's say white takes the bishop. He can now recapture with the knight. He will lose the rook, but this rook is now protected, and black has two minor pieces against the rook, so black has a big advantage here. But instead of all that, Levi went pawn takes f6. Now, note that this bishop is hanging, but he's also hitting this bishop on g7. So Nicholas took the bishop on b5, Levi took on g7, and rook e8, because this rook was under attack. Now, the position is approximately even. Maybe white has a slight advantage. The game continued. Oh, shoot. The game continued. Long castles, king takes g7 and e4. Now white is probably a little bit better because he has more control over these dark squares. And his bishop is just slightly better than black's bishop. It's really difficult for black to create any targets. Anyway, Nicholas played f6, bishop b3, and b6, protecting the pawn. And as I was watching this game, I sort of expected this game to fizzle out in a draw. Someone like maybe rook d6. Black's going to trade off one pair of rooks. And after that happens, he's probably going to play something like king f7, walk the king over, and go rook d8. Trade rooks, shake hands, and you go home. But Levi had other intentions. He played the move e5. Alright, so with this move, he's sacrificing a pawn, but if black takes, black has double isolated pawns, alright? Now, black can really refuse the pawn sacrifice, because after someone like f5, all your dark squares are weakened. Levi could play someone like bishop g5. Now, rook d8 can never be played, and this is just a very passive position for Nicholas. And white would have a big advantage here. So instead of that, Nicholas takes the pawn, and after bishop g5 goes rook f8, hitting the pawn on f2. Levy goes rook to d2 and bishop c6. And even though this threat looks very easy, right, it's not easy at all to address. If you play someone like f3, black is going to go e4. And now if you take, I mean, black's got rid of his double pawn, and he's just up a clean pawn. Of course, white still has good drawing chances and has some activity, but it's really only black who can win here. So Levy played rook to e1, bishop takes g2, and rook takes c5. Okay, so this pawn is under attack. So Nicholas goes bishop d5, Levy goes b3. So if he gets one more move, he wants to go c4, dislodge the bishop on d5 so he can take this pawn. But Nicholas has other intentions. He goes c4, making sure that white cannot put the pawn there. So Levy took rook d7 check, rook f7, take, and king to b2. So black is up a pawn, but the position is not easy to win at all. Once again, we got opposite color bishops, and white really got good control here over these dark squares on the king side. Anyway, so Nicholas played bishop d5, rook e3 by Levy. And also, what is very important to know is that with rooks on the board, black will always have good winning chances. There might be some endgames where the rook comes off, where it's probably going to be a draw, but it really depends on the situation. Like especially on whether white can keep a blockade here on the king side. Anyway, rook b8, chosen by Nicholas, rook to c3, rook b7, stopping rook c7, and Levy goes bishop f4. So Levy's idea is that he wants to go rook c7 and trade the rooks and transition into a drawn endgame. And here, Nicholas played rook e7. And you might be wondering, like, okay, what is the point behind this move? Right, white can still go rook c7 and trade the rooks. Why did he not then play a move like king f6, improving the position of his king? Well, here Levy would have played rook to c7, and after takes, black cannot go g5 to create an outside past h-pawn, because white has bishop d8 check. King moves up, and this is just a total draw. Alright, so then what is the difference here, like between rook e7? Well, if white goes rook c7 here, he would have traded the rooks, and now g5. Now note that there's no bishop d8 check, so black will create this past h-pawn. White can take, and indeed this is a pawn sacrifice. But black's pawn on h5 is going to be super dangerous, and it's going to be very difficult for white to deal with. So instead of all that, Levy played the move rook to e3, also restraining e5 by black. Now once again, you cannot play king f6, because here you lose your rook. So instead of all that, Nicholas plays rook d7 first, rook c3 by Levy. Once again, he wants to get that rook trade in. Nicholas goes b5, a3, and here rook b7 by Nicholas. Not a move I quite understood. I thought bishop c4 had to be played to sort of block in this rook, and then just, you know, slowly but surely improve the position and try to push for the win. But instead rook b7 was played, bishop g5 by Levy, e5 by Nicholas, try to improve the position of the king, rook c8, king e6, rook e8 check, king f5, and here Levy played rook e7. He was like, alright dude, I think this opposite color bishop endgame is a draw, maybe it's not, but the complications that arise here are pretty wild. It really hinges on one move, whether this is a win or a draw. Anyway, black has to trade the rooks, because if he goes rook b6, white's going to take here, and white doesn't really have much to worry about. I mean, he can eventually create a passed pawn here with his 2-on-1 majority on the queen side, and white should just be fine. So instead, Nicholas trades the rooks, Levy recaptures, and king g4 by Nicholas. Alright, now if Nicholas gets another move, like let's say Levy goes here, he's going to go king f3, hit the pawn, and if bishop c5, once again this idea of g5, and if takes, this h-pawn is just marching down the board, and there's nothing white can do. So instead of all that, Levy played bishop g5, king f3, and bishop e3. Now if Nicholas goes g5, he would take with the bishop. I mean, black gets a past e-pawn, but that e-pawn is easily controlled by the white king and the bishop, and this should be a draw. So instead of all that, Nicholas goes a5 first, because this pawn was also under attack, and know that he could potentially also create a passed pawn here on the queen side. Anyway, Levy goes king to c3, king e2 by Nicholas, and bishop e6 by Levy. Now here, things get pretty wild, and Nicholas played the move g5. As we're watching this game, apparently the move a4 was winning, but this is pretty insane. The lines go something like bishop c7, hitting the pawn, black goes e4, and now if bishop e6, you go g5, pawn takes, And you do not play h4. No, wait, h4. h4 wins the game here, because you just go h3 and pushes down the board. But if white goes king b4, no, wait, that hangs the pawn. Wait, after a4, the tricky move was bishop e3, you go bishop c4, and here there's the move king to b4. But now I believe you go g5, white takes, you take, and due to some very dank reason, it sort of wins for black, or I don't know. Anyway, it was very, very complicated, but a4 was probably the move here for black. Nicholas played g5, Levy took the pawn, and here h4 by Nicholas, but this allowed a draw right away. A better try would have been king to f3. So if white goes bishop c7 to get the bishop to defend, there would have been the move king f4. And now you can still push his pawn up the board, but it's very, very tricky. It might still be a draw because white has the move g6, h4, and bishop d8. You might be like, what? How on earth is this bishop stopping this pawn, right? But after h3, there's bishop h4, and your bishop comes back to g3 just in time. But it's all very, very unclear. Like there might be lines like bishop, there might be lines like king f3, bishop g3, and e4. And e3 is coming. Anyway, all very, very complicated. I think Nicholas should have gone for this, but both players were very, very low on time. I'm pretty sure like trying to figure this out with just a minute on the clock is very, very difficult. Some lines go like king d4, probably there's e3, and if you take, I take. King takes h2, g7, h1, queen with check, and black wins by one move. And it's absolutely insane. If you take the bishop here, I think the same thing happens. You take an f2, take, no wait, here white queen's in check, but you go h2 first, and now if you take, oh my god, you take an f2, g7, f1 queen, white queens, and guess what, queen c4, and you pick up the queen at the very end. Some very insane lines here in this endgame, and if white would have pushed right away, you queen, white queens, and guess what, e2. And now this pawn is going to promote. Because you can give a check, but black just goes king g2. This king can hide here. You push this down the board, and there's simply nothing white can do. Like queen e6, there's just e1. Which is pretty insane that black is winning this game. If f3, you can take the bishop, and then you promote. So pretty insane stuff. I mean, try figuring this out with 1 minute. That's not easy at all. Anyway, instead of all that, Nicholas played the move h4, but now bishop c7 by Levy, hitting the pawn on e5. Oh, and this is where Nicholas missed his last chance. In this position, he played the move e4, but this allowed king d4, the king attacks the bishop, and the king sort of comes back to defend. Instead of that, he should have played b4. Takes, and the idea is simply to distract this king. Now we go e4, and if white goes king to c5, you play bishop f7. The idea is to block this pawn, and after king d4, you go bishop g6. This pawn is blocked, this pawn is defended, and next up, you're going to take the pawn on f2 and roll this down the board. There's simply nothing white can do, because this bishop has to stay occupied, stopping this pawn from going down the board. But once again, very, very difficult stuff. I mean, if white pushes, we take. c5, you go e3. If white goes bishop f4, I guess we go king f3, hitting the bishop. And once again, this bishop has to make a decision. If it goes here, we push the e pawn. If it goes here, we push the h pawn. And simply, this bishop cannot stop both the pawns at the same time. And king e5 also doesn't help, because now this king is not stopping this pawn anymore. So just push it down the board. And if white pushes, he should simply be too late. We push c6, e2, bishop a5, h3, c7, bishop f5, g6, h2, g7, you queen, white queens, and you go queen a1 check, and you pick up the bishop. Wait, but there's bishop c3. I mean, this is insane. You give a check here, this king is in check. If the king goes here or here, you give a check and pick up the queen. Same thing if the king goes to c4. There's king e5, but then there's queen c5. And then you're going to pick up the bishop. And you can always pick up this, and black is first to queen. So pretty insane stuff once again. I mean, these lines go so deep, and calculating this with only just a minute on the clock, we can't really criticize the players for that. But yeah, I mean, pretty insane stuff. But it seems like all these lines win by one move for black. But instead, Nicholas played e4, king d4 now by Levy, bishop f7, and king takes e4. So he's getting rid of the e-pawn, which is really one of black's main trumps. And the problem for Nicholas is here that if he goes something like b4, white can always take, and his a-pawn should always, I think white just goes king here, and if a3, king g4, a2, and bishop e5, just in time stopping this pawn. Once again, pretty tough for Nicholas. White is always just in time here to stop the pawns, and suddenly black is losing, because look at this, white only has 4 pawns, which are ready to march down the board. So instead of all that, Nicholas played h3, Levy played c3. He was like, all right, I don't want to deal with any of this stuff anymore. Nicholas took the pawn, but now Levy went king d4. This pawn is stopped, and now his king is coming after the pawns on the queen side. So Nicholas played a4, king c5, bishop c4, g6, king e3, g7, king d3, g8, queen, bishop takes, king takes b5, king takes a4, king takes a4, and a draw was agreed. A pretty wild fight here between Levi Rossman and Nicholas Theodorou. Once again, not really the result both of these players wanted. I'm pretty sure Nicholas wanted to get going in the tournament. And but yeah, I guess for Levy, he was better out of the opening, but saving the draw there from that endgame is a good result. I just contradicted myself, but that does not matter. Anyway, guys, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.